So in order to sort of start out this discussion, I want to start by giving a definition of astrology, or giving my definition of astrology, which I've sort of developed over the course of the past 10 years by reading different definitions of astrology and sort of feeling uneasy with many of them, and feeling that a lot of them were kind of inadequate because they aren't typically either broad enough to encompass the entirety of the field and the entirety of what people actually do when they use the term astrology, what somebody in China is doing if they're using astrology and using ancient like Chinese astrology versus what somebody in, let's say, the United Kingdom is doing when they're casting a horary chart, and what they're doing when they're practicing astrology. So one of the issues is that sometimes the definitions of astrology aren't broad enough to encompass things like that. The other major issue is that they often are so specific that they sort of are focused on a specific type or a specific conceptualization of astrology. And in doing so, they don't realize that they're not accurate because they're leaving out like this whole other group of what other astrologers think. So I guess that, again, runs into an issue of not being broad enough. But that second part has more to do with typically the people that define astrology outside of the astrological community aren't very familiar with it. So they don't realize that they're coming up with faulty definitions of the subject. So my definition of astrology, which I kind of outlined and defended in an article on my blog a few years ago on the Horoscopic Astrology blog, which I'll link to in the comments for this episode on the Astrology Podcast website, my definition of astrology is that it is simply the study of the correlation between celestial objects and earthly events. So that's a really broad definition, but the main point that it really has to cover is the notion that there's some sort of correlation between celestial objects and between movements in the sky, or the placement of certain celestial objects in the sky, and a presumption of some sort of connection between those movements or those placements in the sky and things that happen on Earth. So something happens in the sky, and then there's a corresponding or correlating event or development that is correlated with that event on Earth. So that sounds like an overly broad definition, but one of the things that I was trying to deal with is the fact that most definitions of astrology are only focused on the causal conceptualization of astrology, where the planets or other celestial objects are thought to directly or indirectly influence events on Earth and actually cause those events to happen. So, for example, many of the definitions of astrology say that astrology is the study of the how the celestial movements or how the planetary bodies cause or influence human affairs on Earth. So, for example, dictionary.com says that astrology is the study that assumes and attempts to interpret the influence of the heavenly bodies on human affairs. Or Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says, the divination of the supposed influences of the stars and planets on human affairs and terrestrial events by their positions and aspects. And then finally, the Oxford Dictionary, the study of the movements and relative positions of celestial bodies interpreted as having an influence on human affairs and the natural world. So the issue here is that virtually all definitions of astrology, especially those from outside of the astrological community, are based on an assumption that all astrologers believe that the planets literally cause events to happen on Earth. And while it's true that there are many astrologers who hold that position and hold that belief, it's also true that there's a large other group in the astrological community that holds that the planets and stars can act as signs or symbols or omens of events that will occur in the future or are occurring now without necessarily being the causes of those events happening. And for that reason, it's inappropriate to include in your basic definition of astrology the presumption that the planets have to directly influence events or influence humans in order for it to be considered astrology. So that's one of the things that I try to sort of deal with in my definition of astrology by simply saying that it's the study of the correlation between celestial objects and earthly events, because then it's broad enough that it encompasses both categories, both those people who believe that there's a correlation between celestial and earthly events because the planets and the stars are literally causing the things that they correlate with to happen, and the other group who thinks that there's a correlation between celestial and earthly events due to some unknown reason, such as synchronicity, but that despite the fact that there's a correlation, there is not necessarily a causation, at least in the sense of that the moon or Mercury going retrograde is not causing you to lose your wallet on a specific day, but it's only acting as a symbol or an omen of that specific event in your life. So that's our starting point. So our starting point is the basic definition of astrology, which is overly broad, but what it makes up for in being overly broad is that it tends to be more accurate in encompassing these two different approaches to the subject that tend to be held by different astrologers.